A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. To the Muslims, assalamu alaikum. To the non-Muslims, peace be with you. And they both mean the same thing. We are now in the section that talks about the reliability of the Quran. And actually, I just wrote this last night because I just found out last night that I'm going to cover this section. And so I just have a few points that I want to mention, inshallah. When we talk about the reliability of the Quran, there's actually one main point that needs to be addressed, which should be obvious, which is that the Quran is not the same thing as the Bible. It's very different. It's very different how it came about and the progress that led to where we are today. For example, there has never been, ever, two different Qurans that two groups of Muslims were arguing over and trying to decide which one was the true one. For 1,400 years, that has never happened. There's never been a false Quran and a true Quran, and people were trying to figure out which one was right, ever. Period. There's nothing you can add to that. Now, often when I bring points like this up and we talk about the Quran and the Bible, usually I get some sort of response from the Christian who I'm talking to at the time, and they, sometimes get this expression on their face like, oh, how could you say that Christians would change the Bible? How could you as a Muslim change the Quran? You couldn't do that. Well, the answer to that is very easy. As I stated, the Quran and the Bible are not the same thing. They're very different. And I'll give just a few examples. Other than actually the first example I've already given, that there's never been a false Quran and a true Quran that people argued over, which there have been different versions of Gospels. In fact, there are 70 other Gospels that people were trying to discern which ones were true and which ones were false, and didn't agree on all of them until 400 years after Jesus. In fact, the earliest Bible that we have a complete manuscript of is called the Codex Sinaiticus, and even that is missing some of the Bibles, or some of the books of the Bible that we have today. And that's 300 and some odd years after Jesus. Third point, or actually the second point, the Quran is in a living language. The Bible is not. You see, there are millions of people who speak Arabic, which is the language of the Quran. The Bible is mostly in dead languages. Ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek, ancient Aramaic. Only a handful of scholars know it. So to change it would be very easy. Third point, the Quran has always been in the hands of the people from its inception. From day one, your average Muslim had access to the Quran, which is not true of the Bible because for centuries it was in the possession of the Catholic Church, and it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that translations were made and widely used among common people. Now, when it comes to the reliability of the Quran, I think we've established that it hasn't been corrupted, that was impossible. And the Quran itself says this. The Quran, the Muslim believes, is the literal word of God. It says in Surah number 15, verse 9, God is speaking, and He says, "We have without doubt sent down the message, and we will assuredly guard it from corruption." So we have this promise from God. Now, as it happens, if I read that to a non-Muslim, you'll say, well, yes, but I don't believe the Quran, so what the Quran says doesn't prove anything to me. Obviously, I have to address that point. As it happens, very few people try to bring the argument that the Quran has ever been corrupted. In fact, I would say probably 99.9% of all scholars, Muslim and non, agree on the point that the Quran we have today is the Quran we had at the time of Muhammad. We went to Brother Ken's house, and while we were there, he said that in fact, yes, I agree that the Quran we have today is the Quran we had at the time of Muhammad. So I doubt he's going to change his argument. He's a very honest man, and so the point that he made then, I'm sure he will stick to now, that the Quran we have today is the Quran we had at the time of Muhammad. But just to solidify and prove this point, I'm going to quote a Christian author named Sir William Muir. Now, he was described as Islamic by Muhammad Hussein Haikal, who was a Muslim scholar from Egypt. He described Sir William Muir in the following words: as a missionary who never misses the occasion to criticize the Prophet of Islam or its scripture. So I think if I quote him, I won't be accused of just quoting people that like Islam or Muslim authors. This man is not very well liked by Muslims. Nevertheless, on page 562 of his book, The Life of Muhammad, he says, "We may, upon strongest presumption, affirm that every verse in the Qu'ran is the genuine and unaltered composition of Muhammad himself." So the Qu'ran we have today, without doubt, is the Qu'ran that we had during the life of Muhammad. So that's really the first point. The point is, it's been pretty well established that the Qu'ran we have today has not been corrupted. But there's a second point that comes along with the reliability of the Qu'ran that we have to deal with, which is, did it come from God? Obviously, that's the next question. Now, if you have a man who's claiming to be a prophet, you have 5 options that you can deal with, okay? If he's claiming he's a prophet, either one, he's insane. He's out of his mind. He is deluded. Number 2, he's lying. He's trying to fool people. Number 3, maybe it is coming from another worldly source, but it's not God. For example, Satan or a demon. Number 4, maybe it did come from God, but it was corrupted, and therefore what it really said we can never know. And number 5, and the final option, is that it really did come from God. We can address the first 2 points very easily with an episode from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. There was an eclipse of the sun, and I've given this example many times, so forgive me if you've heard it before. I hope I don't bore you. There was an eclipse of the sun on the same day that the Prophet Muhammad's son, Ibrahim, his child, died. The Muslims began to circulate as a rumor that this was a miracle. And they came to the Prophet and they said, "It's a miracle. Your son died, and on the same day the sky goes dark." Now, I would suggest that an insane man would believe that. He would say, especially in a time of tragedy, because insane people are more apt to give in to delusion when they're going through some psychological burden or process. So, if he were insane, he would believe that. If he were a liar, then obviously he's an evil man, and he would use that to his advantage. He would say, "Hey, you're right, my son died, the sky went dark, proves I'm a prophet, go tell everybody." Neither one of those were his response. His response was he became angry with the people who brought it up, and he told them, and I'm quoting him exactly, "The sun and the moon are signs of God, and they do not eclipse for the birth of any man or the death of a child of Muhammad." You see, why didn't he give in to delusion? This is the prime time, if he's insane, to give in to his delusion, to find strength in this rumor that they were circulating. He doesn't. Why doesn't he use it to his advantage if he's a liar? So we know he's not a liar or insane. So then was he possessed by Satan? That's obviously the next question. That's usually what I get most often when I make the first point I just made. They say, "Oh, well, then it came from the devil." So let's examine that. If you read the words of Jesus in Mark chapter 3, verse 26, he basically says that any house divided against itself cannot stand. If Satan drives out Satan, then he is divided against himself and has an end. Those are the words of Jesus that describes the nature of Satan. He cannot work against his own interest. You compare that with the Quran, Surah number 16, verse number 98, where in the Quran, God tells Muslims to say, before you read this Quran, you should say, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim," which means, "I seek refuge from Satan the rejected." Now, if this is Satan's book that came from the devil, that is the neatest trick I've ever seen. Because Satan is basically telling people, before you read my book, would you please ask God to protect you from me? How could he get away with that? How would God let him get away with that? Furthermore, it contradicts the Bible and the words of Jesus. The fourth point and possibility, maybe it did come from God, but it was corrupted. I think we've sufficiently proven today that the Quran has not been corrupted. That leaves us with one option, that the Quran did indeed come from God. There are several proofs of this the Muslim can give. I'll give as many as I can in the time frame. And forgive me again if you've heard these examples before. Number one, the example of Abu Lahab. Abu Lahab was a vicious enemy to the Prophet Muhammad. Everywhere the Prophet went, Abu Lahab would follow him and say, "What did that man just tell you?" If Muhammad was talking to somebody about Islam. Muhammad would go away, Abu Lahab would come up and say, "What did that man just tell you? Did he say it's black? Well, then it's white." That was his mentality. This is well documented. Abu Lahab was a very intelligent man. He was known as being very cunning and wise. And people often sought advice from him. As it happens, there's a surah in the Quran, a chapter that was revealed about him, and says, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, he'll never be a Muslim, he will go to hell. The Muslims had this verse for 10 years before he died. It would have been very easy for him to disprove The Quran, Abu Lahab. It would have been easy for him because the policy of the Muslims from day one was instant forgiveness. The day you become a Muslim, you're forgiven. You see? So Abu Lahab could have heard this verse that the Muslims were reciting publicly, and he could have said, well, guess what? Your revelation is wrong. I want to be a Muslim today. How do you solve that problem? He never thought of that. This man that was known as intelligent for 10 years never thought of that. Never occurred to him. And the last point, if I have time, is you have to remember what is the society at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. It was a society where they valued poetry better than anything. This is what happened. This is how the society was. In fact, they used to say that God has blessed the minds of the Greeks and the tongue of the Arab. So they were very proud people. And the enemies of the Prophet Muhammad were very good at reciting poetry. It was the pride of their culture. But yet the Quran comes along and claims to be a better recitation of Arabic poetry than a human being can produce. So I think you'd be pretty fed up with that. This small band of Muslims who nobody was afraid of are claiming to have a better recitation of Arabic poetry than anybody on earth could produce, even if they got together and worked on it. Quran is very clear on that. I think you'd be pretty fed up with that. You'd say, oh, I can't produce something better than that? He can't produce something better than that? Sure you can. Come here, come here. Recite something better than Muhammad's Quran. No one did. They really recognized that this book was a problem. It was too good to be challenged. That concludes my point. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.